through.
Will it just be followed by another though?
There probably will be. In this spot it's stereo, so there's another flight path that way.
Oh,
they coalesce and come together here. Yes.
Marcus, can I just get the spelling of your name so I have that correct? Is it Marcus?
Marcus, and surname is Foth, Foxtrot Oscar Tango Hotel.
Right.
Pronounced Ford. So the TH is silent. Professor Marcus Ford, Chairperson, Brisbane Flight Path Community Alliance.
Okay.
Right, we're happy to go. You're happy with your camera?
Yeah.
Marcus, how would you describe the current airport noise across Brisbane? How is it being managed at the moment?
The management is very, very poor. Whilst the airport might have a sense that they are managing it through noise sharing, the sense of the community is that their calls for noise reductions have not been heard. We've had now a change of flight path since the new runway launched on the 12th of July 2020, so we have now had our 3-year anniversary. And looking at the number of complaints, the intensity and the emotional reaction, the fact that we had 1,000 people protest at the airport only a couple of weeks ago, I think the management is still very, very poor, and the issue has been largely the severity of the issue has been largely ignored.
So Airservices Australia has launched this noise action plan. They've got a number of options to look at changing routes. Have you been through the options? Do any of them appeal to you?
There is a couple of things to say first up around the noise action plan, and now this yet again phase of community engagement, as Airservices calls them. As we've said in the beginning, already in 2022 in April, the government hired external consultants to actually look at what Airservices had designed to date. Already back then, a report was released that suggested there's major flaws with regards to the work that they had done. There was 48 recommendations produced. In a relatively short period of time, it took the consultants to identify those limitations, and that suggests to us that we cannot trust Airservices. Whilst they keep saying it's their bread and butter, flight path design is their bread and butter, the actual issue here at stake is the conflict of interest. Both the airport as well as Airservices are corporate entities, so their interest is to maximize their revenue and their profit. And so if I just kind of read out one statement from one of the engagement documents, this is the engagement that they are doing in parallel. So whilst we are now looking at the launch of the next phase of the community engagement, Airservices in parallel is also engaging industry. And so this document is from the industry engagement portal, and the very first sentence here says that to enable the long-term growth of Brisbane Airport, we must maintain the ability to operate with minimal operational constraints. So whilst they're promising the community some sort of betterment that is always in the future, like for 3 years we heard now, oh, there will be some improvements, but it's now 3 years. Even if these options that are on the table right now, that have been launched or proposed today, would to be decided upon today, it would take another 12 months at least, if not 18 to 24 months, for anything to change at all. So compare this to the same kinds of engagement that is happening with industry stakeholders, where these kinds of sentences are being published to the very close kinds of partnerships that they're having with airlines and airports.
Yes, that's true. It's a very slow timeline. They sort of have acknowledged that. What do you think of their noise sharing plan? Do you think that is a fairer way for everyone to have a little bit rather than some suburbs to have a lot?
No, we don't believe it's a fair plan at all. In any other airport internationally where noise sharing has been implemented, it comes as the very last option. First, we look at the very substantive instruments available to the airport, to the Australian government to actually reduce noise. The first principle should be noise reduction. That is also in line with ICAO standards, the International Aviation Peak Body, that is suggesting that first of all we should be looking at noise reductions. Now both the airport as well as Airservices have not actually come to the table with any sort of compromise or sacrifice. So in this over 3 years time period, we are still dealing with suggestions such as you suggested, like the noise sharing option, which in essence you got to imagine you move to a suburb, you have been living there for a long time, for 20, 30 years, all of a sudden people move in next door, it's a party house. There's very loud music being played all through the day, all through the night, right? You've got to now imagine there's no legislation in place whatsoever. There's no upper maximum, there's no time restrictions. This party house can just do their parties all the time. And the suggestion from the authorities would be that the solution to this is to change opening the windows on different days. So that, you know, maybe the kitchen window is open on the Monday and the living room window is open on the Wednesday. So noise sharing is in essence just a farce. It allows the airport to convey a sense of solution that is actually then eventually going to be eaten up by the growth aspirations that the airport has. We want to turn Brisbane into an airport city with 110 flights an hour. So you got to actually let that sink in. That is the same capacity as Hong Kong, Singapore, major airports. It's far outperforming the capacity of Sydney and Melbourne. And here we have no restrictions in place that would even stop them, which is why they are so adamant in their industry engagement key messaging that they want to hang on to that at all costs.
Where did you get the 110 an hour? Is that one of their sort of growth aspirations, or is that
from Channel 7?
Oh,
so
okay.
You interviewed the Brisbane Airport CEO before the launch, so that was early 2020. We have the video footage on our website where Gert-Jan de Graaf, the CEO of Brisbane Airport Corporation, has been saying not only is there going to be a capacity increase from 52 flights an hour to now 110 flights an hour, he is also on the record saying that the new runway will allow them to direct flights away from people, away from residential areas, and over water, uninhabited areas. Now that turned out to be a big furphy, because we can now see with the number of complaints, the intensity of the protest, the fact that Airservices is engaging the Queensland Police Service in conducting welfare checks because people are suicidal, that gives us indication enough and evidence enough that the airport is on the wrong track here.
What could they do now to do this noise reduction, do you think? How is that possible? What action could they take to reduce noise right now?
There is a number of very simple instruments at the disposal of Minister Catherine King, the Minister for Transport and Infrastructure. We've been calling out for some of these instruments. They have already been implemented across a number of airports in Australia as well as internationally. Obviously, the first one is a curfew. A curfew is in place in Sydney, the Gold Coast, Essendon Airport, Adelaide Airport. Internationally, it's in place in a number of locations. The curfew needs to be bundled with a demand management strategy. In Sydney, for instance, it's called a long-term operating plan that is looking at ways to actually reduce the noise. There's also existing legislation in place in Australia to collect noise levies. For instance, the new airport in Western Sydney, the proposal is to actually acquire properties that are becoming unlivable and uninhabitable, as well as to insulate some of those properties. The airport authority that is still controlled by the Australian government has voluntarily agreed to these measures. Here in Brisbane, none of that is on the table. In fact, Catherine King, as the Minister, is busy here taking photos and selfies at the Cross River Rail infrastructure projects, but she's not willing to meet with affected communities. She is categorically ruled out even meeting with us.
That's appropriate.
And there is one going overhead just now.
Do you want less planes? Is that part of the solution too?
The indication from other airports, even bigger and even more profitable airports than Brisbane, suggests that communities can co-inhabit and co-live with a profitable airport. So for instance, Sydney, and that's a city that hosted the Olympic Games, because the Olympic Games is also now used as an excuse to say we cannot have any restrictions. Sydney coped really, really well with the kinds of
Light's just gone. Sorry. The light's just gone. It's moved. I'll do a few batteries. I just gave it a tap. That's the technical term.
Kaput control. I'll just get my battery.
Yeah, no worries.
Sorry.
Just make it hard to have a conversation when the plane goes over.
And this is today relatively quiet. They are sometimes scheduled to be in 2-minute intervals. coming from two directions, and there's no respite. So with the wind changes, you just get them coming the other way.
Yeah. Is your property affected? Is that sort of how you got involved in this group? And
we kind of woke up in July 2020. We knew about the new runway, but we kind of trusted that there is due process in place in Australia, and we were proven very, very wrong. So the fact that the messaging all the way back to 2007 was all about the top priority mode is to fly over the water. It would be great for Brisbane. It will actually reduce the noise. Those communities under the legacy flight costs were also told it would be great for them as a noise reduction, and none of that has materialized. So I think
you hadn't been affected by plane noise before the new runway, and you were affected after.
It went from 0 to 100% in overnight in essence, but this is during COVID. So the fact that it's now actually gotten to pre-COVID levels of traffic is making things even worse. But
travel's back to normal, isn't it? Really. So sorry about that.
Are we still rolling? Do you want me to
sorry. Do you remember where you were?
It was about the instruments available. So in essence, Minister Catherine King, as the Minister for Transport and Infrastructure, would be able to use existing legislative instruments. So she has the ability to issue, for instance, what's called a ministerial direction to Airservices. That is precisely what happened in Sydney as a result of the community protests that happened there in the 90s. Those ministerial directions from the 90s are still in effect and are still in place today. There is the ability to introduce a curfew, a long-term operating plan, to collect noise levies in order to help people either move or insulate their houses. We also believe that Airservices needs to be reformed because of this conflict of interest. So the fact that this is now a corporate entity that has the interest of generating revenue and profit from the levies they collect from airlines, and this particular document that has leaked out of their industry engagement forum, that's all suggesting to us that they are not the right entity to help communities. So they've completely abdicated their legislative obligation to protect communities. The legislation is saying Airservices' two priorities are safety and community protections. And what seems to be the case is that the priorities are safety and making money. And so we really need to look at reform work urgently, because this debacle is now also unfolding at other airports with regards to the third runway in Melbourne, as well as the Western Sydney airport. And there is a lot of pressure on the main Kingsford-Smith airport in Sydney to lift its curfew, to change the curfew hours. So there's a number of communities across Australia affected by this debacle.
The options given in the noise action plan, do any of these, do you see a benefit out of any of these? Would you be voting for any of these, and the changes that they suggest, will they make any difference?
The one that stands out for us is the one that is about SOT props, which is the technical term for operating the two runways so that both arrival and departure happen over water. There is two issues with that. One is the bay isn't entirely empty either. So there's island communities and bayside communities, and we have witnessed, for instance, flights that curve around immediately after takeoff, and they will hit Cleveland, Wellington Point, Manly, Redcliffe Peninsula kinds of communities. So comparing again to Sydney, where they use precision navigation to direct the flights away from populated areas, even when they fly over the water, is something that we want to see. The second point around that proposal that's been launched today is that there is strings attached to it. So, for instance, one of the fact sheets suggests that they first need to seek approval from CASA, the Civil Aviation and Safety Authority. Now, we've been there before. They've also tried, both Brisbane Airport and Airservices, working together to lift what's called the tailwind restrictions from 5 knots to 10, and that didn't work, and so now they tried again from 5 knots to 7 knots. That would enable them to operate SOT props more often. This proposal today is talking about going to CASA and asking for the limitations of the cloud cover to be reduced from 2,000 feet to 2,500 feet. Now, what we believe is going to happen is the typical good cop and bad cop scenario. So Airservices is publishing these very cushy fact sheets that suggest to the community that change is coming. And then last time it took over a year for CASA to make a ruling that says, no, we can't do anything. So then we are already in 2024, maybe 2025, and we haven't seen any change yet. So it's really important for communities to understand that this is engagement theatre. Airservices cannot be trusted. BFPCA is working on a substantive submission to the National Anti-Corruption Commission that launched on the 1st of July, and we have gathered enough evidence from Freedom of Information requests, from Senate estimates, from whistleblower accounts, in order to pursue Airservices and the corrupt conduct that meets the definition of corrupt conduct under the definition that the government has published on the NACC website.
Marcus, isn't being able to go on a holiday and living in a city just mean that airport noise is a reality? I mean, planes have to take off from somewhere, and don't we just sort of have to live with it if we want to be able to travel around our country and the world?
We need to look at this with a reasonable kind of balance between community protections and the economic benefits. We also got to weigh up the fact that this has an impact on the economic productivity of the city. The fact that there is, for instance, specialized surgeons working in the children's hospital that are not getting enough sleep at night, and they're canceling surgery because they just feel that they're not able to perform that surgery in the morning. There is nurses, there's teachers, there's school children and students that are trying to learn under these flight paths. Schools are affected. We have looked at research evidence that suggests that the flight path noise, even though a person may not be aggravated by it, it still impacts very negatively the cognitive abilities, and it causes cognitive impairments as well as an impact on learning abilities. So yes, I fly as well. I have to fly for work. I do like my holidays, but there is a number of examples of airports that are balancing those kinds of considerations with the community considerations as well. And so airports can coexist with communities. What we are asking for is not unreasonable, considering it's in place in so many airports across the world.
I'm happy with that. Oh, yeah, I'm happy with that, Marcus. I think you've explained yourself really well.
Great.
I think I've got everything I